Welcome to another episode of the Information Addicts Podcast. My name is Cassidy. I'm an information addict, and this is my podcast where I explore information, ideas, and beliefs, and try to do those things more responsibly. Today, I've got a conversation with my friend Sam. I know Sam from the Discord. He's got his own little YouTube channel. He is currently getting his PhD, and I wanted to talk to him about what he's doing and sort of what he's been studying. And so we talked about his thesis, and that centers around love. So I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Sam, thank you so much for coming on my channel. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, nice to be here.
We had a conversation a while back now. I think before I moved to Europe, which was really exciting. But so you can obviously, I'll put the little link in the description if people want to watch that back and forth. But before I get too far into the conversation, why don't you give a little background for people who don't know you? Who are you? And whatever you feel comfortable with.
Cool. My name's Sam. I'm currently coming into my second year of my PhD at the University of Bristol. And I have a massive interest in philosophy, Platonism, religion in general, and sort of the relationship between I guess like one of my big interests is like how we sort of perceive value in the world and how we see discern value in the world, and sort of the nature of the human soul such that is the case. And so like all of these things got quite philosophical. So like, yeah, I'm sort of working for my doctorate at the moment, and like looking at the relationship philosophy has to religion. So those, sort of brief intro.
Yeah. And what got you into that sort of interest in the philosophy and religion and sort of this value relationship? Is it always something that has been intrinsically interesting to you, or was there some step along the way that really took you down that road?
Sure. So it's a bit of a journey of like at school, like history was really interesting to me. So it was like history and then politics and then like political theory. So getting into ideas of like liberalism, like, and then reading people like John Stuart Mill and John Locke on like the idea of liberty, like what is freedom, and then seeing how like the historical and political drama is a drama of values in some deep sense. And then it's like, okay, that's interesting, but like what are values? And like what, I think there was quite a climate of sort of relativism growing up, like with like new atheism and this sort of idea, just and in general, like this sort of idea of like, oh, okay, like some culture might think freedom's good, but like some other cultures might not think freedom's good, and that's okay because. And so like working through all of that, like, are there true and real values? Like, is there something substantial over which like history and politics is, with which it's all concerned? And so that led me into a deeper reflection on the nature of value, whether there is such a thing as a sort of trans-cultural values or universal values, I suppose, which then brought me into deeper areas of philosophy, but also religion, because I think that my understanding of religion is that it's sort of concerned with the deepest of values, or the most fundamental of values. So,
well, definitely a big part of that. It's hard. Religion, in many senses, has a lot of unity in the underlying tone of what the purpose of it is. Yet there's also quite a lot of diversity in these sort of not so obvious ways. I think sometimes it takes that participation and kind of digging down to see the little differences or just exposure to those differences. But yeah, that's interesting. Well, let's jump into the topic then, because you were telling me a little bit about your PhD and you mentioned it had something to do with the value of love. So I'd love to throw it to you. Give me a little bit of a idea of what that's about and sort of the questions you're pondering with this work you're doing.
Yeah, cool. So I suppose like the big question is just what is love, which is a very that's a big one. And then sort of associated with that, I'm looking at whether naturalism can really account for love, and also looking at what love's relationship to value is. So I did a talk last month on the idea of intrinsic value in the phenomenology of love. And so what I'm being led to, interestingly, as I'm going through my research, is a reflection upon human nature, like what makes us different from animals. Because clearly we desire certain things, and one of the Greek words is eros, which translates into love. And so clearly we desire all sorts of things in a sort of egocentric way, and clearly animals do that as well. But is that really love? Is that what love essentially is? And so I feel my intuition is to say, well, no, that's not what love essentially is. That might be an aspect of it, but what my talk was about is the higher and lower senses of love. That might be a lower sense of sort of mere desire, but then, is our desire leading us to something ultimate? Is it leading us to something infinite? Is it leading us to something eternal, transcendent? Or is it always concerned with sort of finite material ends? And so the example of hunger is a desire for something that I can satiate and something that's immediate, and that once I eat, my desire is annihilated. But then there seems to be this other longing of the human soul for something which can not be so easily satisfied, a kind of infinite desire. And so, yeah, I suppose that's sort of where I'm at in some of my thinking about this stuff, is that it's sort of put me onto a reflection of what the human being is, like what our souls are. And it seems that there's something in us that is responsive to or yearning for yeah, something. I guess transcendence the best word that I have for it, but something that's not merely sort of construing the world in terms of what I want, which would be a sort of basic sense of what desire is, or like what animals would have, like an instinct to like, there's something more than that. And I think that that's sort of fundamental to what we mean when we talk about love. Yeah, and I think that's I think that's tied up with a lot of spiritual ideas, and I think that commits one to theism. I don't think that naturalism, which would say that we're merely evolved, really has the resources for explaining that kind of phenomenology. And so that's sort of the thrust of my thesis at the moment. And I'm unpacking a lot of that through looking into Platonism and the sort of accounts of the soul that we find there, and this notion of the soul as responsive to to value in some deep sense.
So in your perspective, as you're kind of researching this, what do you think is the modern perception of love, like, or at least as it's communicated? Because I think probably the perception of what most people would communicate about love is not quite their participation with love. But what do you think that perception is, and is it sort of kind of misaligned with this sort of deeper, higher value?
Yeah, I don't know. Like that's a difficult one. I suppose it's just such like it's a weird topic to be researching because it is like everyone has so many layers of meaning like associated with that one word, right? And like,
Yeah.
oh, there's just so much that goes into that. And so, and it's also quite an interesting one because it's like, because I'm approaching it philosophically, and there's a kind of irony of that because it's like, well, it's quite clearly like in some ways something that isn't to be got at that way.
Mm,
I think Pascal said the heart has its reasons which reason doesn't know about, or reason doesn't know, and like that's that thing of like the heart, like what the heart's doing, as on its own sort of course, as distinct from like sort of the rational intellect. I think is very I don't know, that sort of part of, yeah, that's part of it. That's that there in the question. But so what's the modern conception of love? Yeah, I don't know. I think we all have different layers of meaning attached to what it means, but also I think that we also have a sense that it's not there's something ego transcending about it. There's something that moves me beyond like what I desire in some sort of basic sense of like I want this. Like it's like we do have an instinctual life, and like if we're hungry we need to eat, so like not denying that, but love seems to, it really does seem to point to the spirit, to a spiritual um dimension of our being, in my opinion. And it seems to be, it's one of this sort of area where it moves us beyond a conception of ourselves merely as animal or merely as instinctual or merely
mm,
as egoic as well. This idea of the transcendence of the ego, this transcendence of the way I relate the whole world to me and my desires, is love is a moving out of that, beyond that, into a new horizon, into the other. Um, there's like a deep humility and a deep surrender associated with that.
mm.
And yeah, so that's the whole question of what the essence of love is what's really fascinating me, is that it's at one sense a mystery that I almost know that I'm not gonna solve by writing a thesis, of course. um but that's what's so sort of energizing and interesting about it. um yeah, but it also seems to really point to, I think it's like a way of showing a clearly spiritual dimension to the human soul, um, over and against a sort of naturalistic story or an evolutionary story.
Yeah,
Um,
and how did you get to that place where love points to the transcendental versus being some sort of um, biological necessity for survival, or some other materialistic frame? Where to you does that switch to point to something bigger?
yeah, I suppose it's just an intuition, but
Mm,
I think it's an intuition that has like a precedent and a basis in ancient thought. Um, like I just think in a common sense way, like saying I want something isn't the same as saying I love something. And we would want to distinguish like the difference between, or even saying like I like something, that, and like this common sense where we say, oh, like I love that film. It's like,
mm,
okay, so like love's then been used as like a very high liking, but like it's not. It seems, even my intuition is that it's the way we use the word is as something much higher than just saying it's a preference. It's something I just like. It's a like I really see it as like a recognition of fundamental value or reality, like like the way we're oriented to what is most real. Um Um,
Well,
yeah,
love is probably such a tricky word in the English language because it does have so many perceptions and meaning, and the baggage we bring to that word, depending on the way we participate with it, changes the meaning of it. Whereas, you look at something like the Greek, where they have far more different ways of expressing different types of love, right? And so there's more of a box to put those things in versus this word love that, yeah, is it a preference to pizza? Is it, a deep romantic feeling? Is it a commitment to something deeper than your own desires? Like, those are all definitions that I can associate with love, but used in different ways depending on how I'm framing the word or the context in which I'm using it. So yeah, I could see why it would be difficult. I think, especially from a philosophical standpoint, because you're right. There is something inherently emotional about love, which I think many people seem to feel the need to completely separate from the rational, which I tend to believe is somewhat of a mistake. Like, there's certainly a balance to be played within those roles of not letting emotions overrule you, but there's something about the emotional state and the way that acknowledging them and the way that they infest our worlds do have a relationship to reason. But I can't imagine how difficult it would be to try to take this philosophical point to
well,
explore this
yeah,
thing.
well, the word philosophy has in it the idea of love as well, right?
Sure.
So there's like it's I don't know, like it's definitely something I'd thought about, but the deeper I go into it, it's really interesting. Like the Greek word nous translates both as intellect and heart.
Mm.
Like, and there's these like really interesting things of like, okay, yeah, but maybe they are connected or like come from the same source, like, because I really think, like, for example, like, so if you think like philosophy is pursuing the truth in some way, one has to love the truth, love reality. There has to be a kind of movement of the spirit, like a passion for that to even matter, if you
Right.
see what I'm saying. As with all sorts of domains, as with the aesthetic domain, the ethical domain, all the different areas of culture, I think there has to be some kind of basic orientation towards yeah, value for us to even care, for it to even matter.
Mm.
Um and so that's where I think the heart, it's how I'm sort of coming to understand the heart as the our or the orientation of our souls towards the deepest values, and like from there intellectual activity can really get going. But that's the given framing phenomenologically where it all sort of starts. That's the ground, the wellspring of it all, which is really an act of love, um to sort of a very sort of primal orientation of us towards, um yeah, I mean, in Plato it's called the good, so, or but in traditional theology, God. um that fundamental orientation makes everything else possible in some way. And I think there's something about the way our culture's gone in the last few centuries, that at least with the increased rationalization and mechanization, different schools of thought, that has, I don't know, maybe like confused us about what that word intellect means.
Mm.
Um, and this sort of coming reconnection to the heart and, um, to these sort of deeper values, I think is, um, yeah, I think it's really important. Basically, I think it's a corrective to a sort of hyper rationalistic or materialistic mechanistic viewpoint. And I
Right.
think it's also very immediate. That's why it really, because it's quite the mystery, like the whole what is love thing, but it's also just so like immediate and like everyone knows. Like even if you don't know in a way that you can like articulate, and it's really difficult to articulate it, everyone still knows like what it means at some level. Like it's very, very primal.
Mm.
It's very like fundamental to the human experience, it seems to me. Um, mhm.
Yeah, no, I mean it definitely is. And I think a lot of the questions, whether they be sort of the philosophical or the moral, and more trending towards the moral, but there is this sort of emphasis on love in a sense of like what is the loving thing to do, what is the and you kind of look at the transcendentals, right? The good, the beautiful, the true. And it seems the way that modern, philosophical exploration, particularly within the moral frame, is very truth first focused, where we have to find the truth. And there, in some way, there's this argument of like maybe it's the love of truth that like spurs people on. But I do think sometimes it's the love of good that spurs on the search for truth, because to know what is good and the desire to know is good is leading that fact of like, well, if there is some true way of expressing morality or the way that we should live in the world, it's got to be grounded in the truth to bring good. But I think where, and this kind of goes back to the beauty conversation we had last time, beauty's kind of off the table. We've stopped talking about beauty. And so when you're talking about love, it does feel like me this embodiment of the three, the true, the beautiful, and the good.
Mm.
Because without all three of those things, do you ever have like this full encompassing view of love? No, there's something missing as part of that. So it's very interesting to me in that process of love being this highest value and this highest order to make sense of the transcendentals. I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, this. I think it's from Augustine, the idea of the ordo amore, the order of the loves, like the order of the heart. And so,
Mm,
no, what you said about the good and the true is definitely true. Definitely, that's what Plato says in the Republic. He says that that however good the true is, the good, the good is true, is like more real, is superior to it,
mm-hmm,
because and by the good he, yeah, very mysterious idea in Plato, but it's like that is something like the principle of reality or the highest value. I mean, you get people like Rudolf Otto and Mircea Eliade in the 20th century talking about the idea of the holy itself
mm,
as a phenomenological category, and I think that comes close to it too, because I'm reading a phenomenologist called Max Scheler, who who sort of stratifies values. How does he do it? In sort of five different levels, from what's useful, what's pleasurable, what's important for health and vitality, um, what's noble and base, and then what's holy and unholy. And these
mm,
are his Shailer's hierarchy of values. And again, the love thing's implicit in that, because like there's all these things that we can love and do love, and that structure the different areas of human endeavor and enterprise, like yeah, even like liking ice cream could be a kind of love in that sense. But Shayla's point would be like, yeah, but that's at the level of liking and disliking. There's, the higher level than that is the vital sphere for him. So maybe if you eat ice cream all the time, it's not the best for your health, but you might like it, right? And so it's like, and so then this comes into this really interesting idea of sort of like justice. Like justice adds the ordering of the loves. So like
mm,
yeah, because it's really interesting. You get it in the sort of Christian ascetic tradition, like Evagrius and stuff like that. But like the idea of like sin as excess, the idea of like if I eat, well, that was what like glut would be, right? Glut would be just eating chocolate ice cream all the time. But like it's not to say that the love of chocolate ice cream doesn't have a legitimacy to it. Like it's a celebration of creation, it's a celebration of something that's good.
Right.
But then there's like this sort of excess in that direction, and then a sacrificing of like a higher good, you see, and then it's and so then yeah, I think of that in terms of sort of like harmony, like the idea of like harmonizing the heart, like which is I think part of what the life of virtue means is to get it all in the right order, to love things proportionally, appropriately, um yeah, throughout the whole hierarchy, and I think that's really established in the love of the holy, which the love of God, which from which it all sort of flows. Um,
Right.
and I think that's yeah, it's just an interesting one because like I don't wasn't raised Christian or raised in a faith, but it's just like the more I reflect on the like the structure of human experience and life, like it just seems so clear to me that there's a truth to that idea that getting our love in order, so to speak, is yeah, really, really fundamental um to life and to the pursuit of virtue and to the ordering of society, to
Mm.
all sorts of things. Um
So how was that for you to go from this place where you were not, born into a religious household that wasn't given as, the answer to the question, right? How was it for you to go through this exploration and find yourself being drawn to this idea of the transcendental or something higher? Was that difficult?
um I'm still sort of working it out. Like in
Yeah.
some like it's interesting this thing about the heart, right? Because I feel like I've always like had a sense of God in my heart if I didn't have the words for it, put
Mm.
it that way.
Yeah.
It's like I don't know, just like the beauty of life, the mystery of life. These transcendentals you mentioned before, like even being interested in truth is sort of being in seeking after the eternal domain and seeking after what's really real
Right.
and isn't subject to flux. And so intimations, glimpses, I suppose, have 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 definitely punctuated my whole life and whole development of yeah, glimpses of the divine. I don't think I'd ever would have described myself as an atheist,
Mm.
but I was very, I don't know, in my early 20s, I was quite confidently agnostic. Seems like a super reasonable position to take. Like, but then it's just like, yeah, it has just been a real reflection on value and where it comes from and what it even means for us to be able to respond to value. Like, like, you know, it's 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 a hard one, like what the difference between a human being and an animal is, but there's something about this intimation of the divine in the human being, um, which is expressed in like the highest forms, like the highest cultural forms, like the greatest stories, the greatest buildings, music, poetry, um, thoughts, like all of these different things. It how do you account for the highest? Because like really, if there is no truth, is there is no immaterial dimension to reality. Like, if materialism holds, it is all just nothing. Like the whole of culture is just nothing. It's just And I guess I guess it has to be like an intuition at some level, but like, you know, like if you look at a Gothic cathedral and just say, oh, like that's nothing, you're just wrong. Like it moves the soul. Like it's so deep. Like what that's or what a true thought can do, or what a good person can do, what someone embodying virtue in some way can do to lift you up and lift you to move you and such like this. So, well, I guess what I'm saying in a roundabout way is that I think that the whole of creation participates in the divine to some degree or not, and that there are these examples of like what it is to like come closer to that infinite goodness, and that I've always had a sense of that, and I've always sort of had a love of that, you know, and a desire to move closer to that and to pursue that. And I just, yeah, I guess then I learned that like these were the things that people like Augustine and the church fathers and the whole intellectual tradition has been saying, well, yeah, like that's God, like that's the signs of God in creation, like so yeah, don't think it was particularly hard in that sense, in the sense that like I had all the resources within me, or like I
Like there was that intuition within you that was already drawn to that without necessarily having the words, probably. Yet
exactly
seeing that reflected back in these thinkers made it sort of more speakable. Is
more
that
speakable. Yeah, exactly. And it's almost like it's this weird one actually, you know, you say it like reading, yeah, like there's this weird thing about like when you read a truth, it's well, this is Plato's thing of like remembering, like knowledge is remembering. It's like you read something someone says and it's just more like it just chimes true. Like it's like that chimes true of my experience rather than like I'm learning this new idea. It's just like that chimes in with like the very depths of like my experience and what I feel to be real, even though I never
yeah.
had a word for that.
It like completes the melody in some sense, where it's like, oh, like it's fuller and deeper. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good way of saying it. Yeah, because it is musical. It is musical. It's like there's something about, yeah, the way it brings things into harmony, I think, the right words. Um and so yeah, I'm still sort of working through all of that, to be fair. Like attending I've been attending church a bit more recently, went to mass for Christmas Eve, and uh, you know, continue to feel drawn deeper and deeper in.
Mm-hmm.
It, but yeah, no, that musical idea like makes a lot of sense to me. It's just like the more life goes on, it's like the more I'm sort of like remembering what's most true or something like that. But
Yeah. I mean, I think I definitely resonate with you in a lot of ways for myself. I grew up very Christian, very Protestant, non-denominational. And so having that from a birth, basically, that insistence there is a God and this is what he's like, it became in some ways easier to believe in God or you know, find a way to participate in God. But even outside of that, there was always something within me that um, was not bothered by that idea that there is something greater, something divine. I just, you know, look at the world and see that. And I know for many people that's not the case, or at least that's not the described case for them. Um, you know, and I most people have nothing to lie about in that sense, so I tend to believe them.
what do you mean?
Well, yeah, I mean, like you'll have a lot of atheists that say, I have no reason to believe God's in the world. And that's hard for me to kind of put my mind around in the fullest sense. I can get it to a point, especially the more that I dove into atheism. And really tried to hear and understand people who had that belief, and question it myself to say, well, if that's true, that's what I want to believe. But yeah, the way that I saw God in nature, and the way that I saw him reflected in these things, and the way that I saw him reflected in the people who committed their lives to that path. That was really powerful to me. It was like there were some things that I couldn't deny. And then when I committed my own life to that path in a more intentional way, I couldn't deny the things that I see, the things that I was changed by. But
it's interesting, because like, I feel like this is, well, in some way, I can't remember who said it this way, but I think I think it's something like the strongest theistic case is the goodness, like the goodness of the world, and the strongest atheistic case is the evil of the world.
Yes.
And so it's like, if someone's saying, well, like, I don't believe God's in the world because of Auschwitz, it's like, that's why Dostoevsky, like the chapter Mutiny or Rebellion, where was it Ivan is talking about basically all the evil in the world, and Alyosha's just sort of like listening, doesn't really even say anything at the end of the chapter. It's like, I don't know, and I have to kind of be aware of that in myself. Like, I have quite a sunny temperament of like looking on the bright side.
Yeah.
But like, yeah, the other has to be taken seriously. Like, how can you sit here and argue for a philosophy of goodness, beauty, truth, etc., when real evil has happened?
Right.
And real evil happens. And it is there where words start to fail. But then, even so, it's this. Dostoevsky struggled with this in his stories, but
yeah,
there's something about, it's obviously beyond words. It's something about example, like you said, about like a holy person, what that looks like. It's kind of the only answer to the problem of evil. Like, it's can't be argued. It's just that if the faith is in the good, sort of live that forward, right? And yeah, but
well, in the argument of evil, I don't want to minimize that, because I see that, and I understand the pain in that. And there's a part of me that's like, well, when I look at the philosophical arguments, there's things to overcome that, right? Like, I think C.S. Lewis has done a great job in creating that case. But the problem of evil is, a lot of time, it's not really the philosophical argument that we're talking about here.
No, yeah.
It's this higher value of love, where it's like, how could a loving God allow suffering?
Yeah.
And that is not always something that's worth arguing through to express, because it comes to a point of like the compassion of like the pain that we've experienced in the world. It clouds us from wanting to see that. There's that hurt that is overpowering, and like compassion and understanding at that place, to start there, is super powerful, instead of trying to overcome that. But that said, I think when I look at the world and I look at the people who have faced tragedy, and the ones who I've seen overcome it with the most grace, with the most strength, and that's not to say perfectly, but with the most sort of admiration, were the ones who had this belief in something bigger than themselves, and this transcendental thing, that even through this, it could be made for good. And that doesn't get to the sense of whether it's true or not, but it's a very powerful thing. And it's one of those questions that I had. Like, I tend to be of the position that if I were to be an atheist, I could be nothing but a materialist subjectivist, with the belief that, everything is determined. We are big, complicated domino systems. You know, good and evil doesn't really exist except for our instincts of survival. And for that case, you know, it's you can't really blame somebody for the instinct that has been given to them. Yet there's that recognition that, well, a belief of anything that can keep you surviving is going to be beneficial for the continuation of the species. And so to fight against religion when it gives so many people life and hope, I can't hold that position. I mean, it like it wouldn't make sense for me to hold that position. You know, and then it gets to the problems of like, well, if evil doesn't exist, how can I be mad at religious people for this, that, or the other?
That's that's the thing with evil for me is like it's almost like it presumes the good. Like to be outraged at evil does presume the good. You know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um of otherwise what that's what it is. It's a perception that this state of affairs has fallen very far from what is good.
Yeah. And when you look at a faith tradition, most faith traditions have some explanation of evil. Now, whether someone buys that or not, you know, that's that's something that's not quite easy. And that's something I struggle with as well. Like I believe in God, but I also can't help to believe it. In the sense that um, you could pay me $100,000 to say I don't believe in God, but that's just not the truth of what it is. I can't change my beliefs on my whims. There's something a bit out of my control with that.
mm-hmm.
And so in these places where people can't buy Christianity, can't buy the idea of God, well, I can't necessarily put any moral blame on them in any sense, because belief is something much more complicated than what we will ourselves to do.
Right, which is like this is my real interest philosophically is exactly that is like because like I believe everyone's religious, but then
Yeah.
that's a no, but that's already kind of a controversial
Yes.
statement, right? Because it's you could say that's quite disrespectful if someone's saying, no, I'm an atheist and here are the reasons for it. And I hear that argument. I don't mean it disrespectfully, but
Right.
I do think there's a very strong philosophical argument for it. And that's why I'm looking so much into Plato, because it's like if you think there is a truth and there is a goodness, you need a metaphysics to account for that. And
Yeah.
it's not a materialistic one. It's really not. It's it's a kind of spiritual vision. And so the thing with evil as well is like there's different perspectives on it, obviously, but there's a tradition that says it is a perversion of our love, and it's a weird one to think about that because it's like, are you really going to say evil is an act of love? But then, but then this gets to what I was saying about this disorder of the love is like
Right.
I think, like I do think that pride, which is the chief of the sins in the ascetic traditions, like is is it not love of your own self? Is it not love of your own will? You know, does that not love not sort of blind you to the truest sense of love? Love in the sense of
Mm.
desire, love in the sense of your own sort of pursuing of what you construct as good, you construe as good. And there's also this thing
Mm.
of like God's creation is good. And so like there's this subtlety to like if God's creation is good and God's the foundation of it, then evil is a kind of confusion of that. Like it's a distortion, a jumbling up of the good order of God.
Right.
It's not to absolve any blame, like we're responsible for evil, but there's a kind of I kind of think of it as a thing of perception. Like
Mm.
I think I believe we have an inner eye. I believe the nous is an inner eye, like our spiritual eye, and I think that can become blinded. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, and clarified.
Yeah, well, I definitely think the ways we act in the world, the things we consume, have this huge effect in the way that we shape the way we see the world and what we're open to, right? Um, and that can be in a good way and a bad way, right? We're all having to make these choices, make these calculations of what we're going to take in and what we're going to, um, absolve ourselves from or, restrain ourselves from. And so I think the actions and the way that we frame the world and the spirits in which we act within the world have a huge effect in the way that we can see truth, good, beauty, goodness, and truth. um, but yeah, that I think in a modern frame, it becomes really difficult to have that hard conversation of like, is my perception of truth, beauty, and goodness operating in the proper order? Because I do think evil in many ways is trying to grab good on our own terms, defining how to gain that without reflecting to some higher order. And I mean, I think C.S. Lewis talks about this very well. I think it's in Mere Christianity, but talks about this as well. The idea of you can have good without evil, just like you can have metal without rust. But it's that thing that it is this sort of corruption of good. But oftentimes when we take action in the world that's a sin, whether it's something minimal like the overindulgence of ice cream or something very extreme, there is this sort of mixed order of like trying to gain the good or the beautiful or the true, but in the wrong terms. So that what you said about that order made a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, it's it's a really difficult one because I think it has to do with the self. Well, I guess the
Mm,
ego is sort of the modern word we could use for it, but like there's the ego sort of blinds the inner eye because it's like this, and this is how I sort of understand the doctrine of the fall, or like the paradisal state. Like, what would it have been to walk with God? Well, it would have been to see purely noetically, purely with that, have our inner eye fully opened. And what does the fall mean? Well, it would mean that like we have that same capacity to know God. It's just that there's covered over it with the rust. You could use that analogy, or the dirtying of a mirror or something like that. Like the ways in which it becomes covered by misperceptions and
mm,
and such like that. Um, which is why I think like really exemplary forms of goodness, truth, and beauty are exactly what sort of recall us to what who we really are, and to what we're made for as well. Um, I think it's the perfection of our nature is to live into that um spiritual seeing, to try to see again.
mm,
Wordsworth has this great poem on it, where like whither has gone the visionary gleam, when he took in Ode to Intimations of Immortality. When he talks about the vision we had as children and the way that the world had the glory and the freshness of a dream once upon a time, but it is not how it was of yore. Turn to where I may. What was once this fresh, radiant, Edenic perception becomes a habit. It becomes kind of
mm,
like covered by the dross of habit and time and repetition, and
mm.
and so yeah, I think there's a very deep sense. I've thought a bit about what Christ's parable about becoming as children before entering the garden. Like, there's something about I think there's something about kind of um, remembering to see as a child in a
Mm.
deep sense, which is not to say to regress into immaturity, but to as a like in maturity to remember that. Yeah, it's a strange one, but like I think there's a sense in which we cover over like our essential perceptions, like the true perceptions, which are very simple, very elegant, very just like the truth is the truth. It always has been the truth, like and so it's more I don't know, a Tower of Babel thing or something where it's like we've become confused about that stuff, and I think that's why yeah, I think that's why things like beauty, musically, visually, or whatsoever, are often just there's a simplicity to it and a unity to it that kind of helps us to see again, helps us to perceive in the way that we're meant to.
So have you found this sort of harmony within these ideas that you're finding through your studies affecting the way you're living? Do you feel like it's changing you in the real world?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's definitely influenced my decision to pursue my PhD, pursue academia. Like I want to commit my life to truth in some sense. So, and that's been I don't know. I hadn't made that commitment before. It's always interested me, but like that's what I want. That's the path I want to pursue. And so understanding what that even means, it has been a very deep change.
Yeah.
Because again, like with philosophy, it's like you can just say philosophy is redundant, obsolete. Doing a PhD in philosophy is like the most ridiculous thing. Like if materialism holds, it's just obsolete. Like why would you do that if we live in a materialistic world?
Yeah.
Like really, like really, like and so that's been an area of big reflection for sure. I also, I don't know, encouraging my creativity, making music, like just yeah, just this I think the effort to see is much more important than the effort to put words on it or to explain it in some way, which is the irony of the love thing. But it's the actual putting articulated words on it is, in my opinion, completely secondary to the primary perception, to the actual felt experience of it, and to the discerning of the essence of it, really, because we see the essence directly. And so.
Well, I loved your point about, returning to that view of a child, because I have, 5 nieces and nephews now, and I've gotten to see them grow up in front of my eyes. And I've always liked kids. I never had any animosity to them, but there's something very different to see someone so close growing up and from, birth till, my oldest is 5 now. And so she, just watching her grow up and realizing, oh, kids are so much smarter than we ever give them credit for. And of course they do silly things like we all do silly things. And there's something within us that I think even as adults, we still have those childlike fears. We still have those childlike wonderments, but there is this sort of feeling like we've got to put them away, put them in shackles, but taking the time to enjoy the little moments and finding that wonder in the world again.
Yeah, it's that wonder, because I say it, wonder is the beginning of philosophy. I think Socrates said that, and it's like that it is that wonder, because it's like the questions kids ask are completely legitimate questions. Like, and you're just like, oh, like, that's just how the world is, as if like that's some normal thing.
Yeah, we've taken it for granted that like we process those same things, we ask those same questions. And I think a lot about the way that we operate in big question exploration, right? On the internet, you've got all of these people fighting with each other, searching for truth.
Yeah.
And I do think most people are searching for truth, like capital T truth. But I think too much insistence on that without the acknowledgement of beauty and letting that be part of the conversation and the good and the way those interact, it just sucks the wonder out of so many things, where it becomes about, I have to defend truth, and it's my obligation to defend truth at any means.
Interesting.
And so I like that idea of like having that wonder and that exploration, not to minimize the idea of truth, because I still think truth is very important.
Truth's a mystery, though. That's the thing.
Yeah, isn't
like
it?
It really is. Like, that's the thing. Is like, yeah, it's a subtle line, isn't it, with dogma? That's why I think discussion is so important, because discussion takes that assumption that it's a mystery we're exploring as the starting point, which is all through Plato's dialogues. But it doesn't take the thing that I know what the truth is. And it's not to say that there isn't a truth, and that what can be said in the course of a discussion can't entirely conform with what is true. But sure. It won't be exhausted. There's an inexhaustibleness and a mystery to it for sure. And it's that sense of wonder. Sorry, go on.
No, well, I was just gonna say there's so many layers of truth as well, where maybe I understand 75% of some topic of truth, yet it takes that one person to give me a 1% that I couldn't see, that unlocks to understanding a fuller sense, or making me realize, oh, maybe I don't know 75% of the thing that I think that thought I knew, or what have you. And there is something very collaborative about the understanding of how we understand things are true that I don't always feel gets enough credit in the space, because we want to prove we're true.
Say more about that. So collaborative. Go on.
Like there's all these different fields of study, right? We've got philosophy, we've got history, we've got psychology, and all of these different fields have different methodologies and processes and the way that we think. And each person as an individual is wired differently to be drawn to certain fields in different ways. That's why, someone who might be a stellar psychologist would never make it as a microbiologist or a filmmaker or whatever. And so by living and participating and embracing the natural sort of wirings of our bodies and the way that we process in the world, I think it has this ability to open us up to a certain view of what's true, and a certain understanding that's true that couldn't be gained otherwise. Yet because you have that, you have to understand the limitations of the truth that the person in the other field who's lived a whole different life than you also has a piece to it. So I mean, you look between us, you went down the philosophy route, you're getting your PhD, I'm a filmmaker. And so there are certain things, the way that I'm going to see and the way that I'm going to view the world and the process through going that path, that you could never have grasped because you just didn't live my life. And my brain is wired differently than yours. And I think sometimes in the conversations, there's particularly in political conversations, you have a right versus left leaning. And whether that is sociologically ingrained through upbringing, or if there's something biological inherent in wiring, either way, there's a difference in the way that they think. And it often gets put in this frame of right versus left, where it's like, well, the right is right because of this, or the left is right because of this, where without the recognition that you need the two to see the full picture. Because if you're more left inclined, you're often able to see certain things in a way that a right inclined person wouldn't, a more conservative person wouldn't. And I think they give pieces to the puzzles. And if we could find a way to stop fighting about it and come to a more uh, exploratory or, wonder view of the world, I think those conversations can be a lot more productive.
Well, I have a comment about that, and this is Shayla, who I mentioned earlier, the hierarchy of values person. He has this interesting thing about like material values. It's quite interesting. He says like material values are inherently divisive in the sense that if we both go into an ice cream shop and there's only one scoop of chocolate ice cream left, the only way you can share it is to halve it. If you know what I mean, like literally, like you have half, I have the other half. That's how we
you
do it
cut
with
the
food.
half, I pick. Yeah,
We can share, but we have to divide it to share,
yes.
right? Because it's a finite material good. Whereas the truth or beauty or the things we're discussing, actually, it's like the opposite. It's like they unify, they bring together. This is and they're inexhaustible. They're not of that kind. Of course, there's plenty of truth to go around because it's like eternal, immaterial. It's not partaking in corporeality in the same way that ice cream is. And so Shayla made this really interesting point about the hierarchy of values, that certain, like the noble, what is noble, what is good, what is true, what is beautiful, these sort of ideals, what is just, raw, tend to unify because inherently they're not divisive in the way that certain material goods are. And it relates again to this order of loves. It's like if our love is at a materialistic level and we only see that there's only enough, I don't know, taxation dollars or whatever the political issue is to go around, that discourse is going to fragment inherently because the nature of the issue, the nature of the thing that's concerned is a kind of either or thing.
Right.
But it's not to say that that's the whole world. And I think that part of what's really important is this ascent to higher values, basically, which is an ordering of the loves, is to say that political issues, of course, matter, but the discourse has to, I think political discourse has to be transcended at some level into a discussion about, spiritual values is the best word I have for it, really. But, but this gets to sort of like medieval ideas about the saeculum and the sacred. Like what I'm saying, I guess, is that the discourse has to be taken to a sacred level, because that's the only basis of unity. That really is the only basis of unity. Like an entirely secular discourse, secular in the technical sense of like, I don't know what our budget is for this year or whatever. Like, but seriously, like that's that is time. Like from this date to this date, we have a finite amount of dollars in our budget. Or whatever. Like that is a discourse which is valid and has its place. And I don't. Every business needs to do that, I suppose.
Sure.
But like, yeah, it's inherently secular in the technical sense of like it's bound to time, it's bound to materiality. And I really think that's a failure of the imagination. I've thought this for a while, but I think it's a failure of the imagination to, and that's a disenchantment in the sense of like a hex or a spell, to failure of imagination and a disenchantment for that discourse to, but for that discourse not to be transcended. It's like a trap. It's like because really the whole point is to speak of what's true, and like the eternal truths necessarily ground secular life.
I think more than just give us truth, like give us truth that we can put into a story that's beautiful. Because like truth for truth itself is sort of meaningless. So like in a materialistic framework, truth, I guess, would exist. Does truth matter as much as if we didn't have some higher transcendental? Probably not.
No, I guess what I'm trying to say is like, is getting your loves right in the sense of the order amore, like it's caring about the right things in a
Yeah.
sense. That's what I'm trying to
Yeah.
say. And like, I do think that's associated with truth for sure, but I see where that word, it might not be the best.
Well,
But
no, I've been thinking about it too, where we talk about science, right? Like the love of science is taking facts that are true and putting them into practice in the world to help us learn more about creation. But it's not the facts that matter in and of themselves. It's the story that those facts tell us and how it leads us to a truer participation in the world. And so there's like such power in the truth, but if we're just spitting facts at each other, it's not very helpful if we don't have a way to put it in a frame and live it out and have it shape the way we see the world that aligns to something truer. And in my sense of like, and maybe this is idealistic to believe, or part of this Christian framework that I'm from, but I think the truth in its full orientation is beautiful, and it tells us a beautiful story. And that's why we ultimately pursue truth, to find that beauty in the world that we instinctively are drawn to in so many ways.
oh yeah, I completely agree with that. Well, I think that's connected with this idea of wonder. Like, I think to be wonderstruck is to apprehend beauty in some way, or like they're very connected.
Mm.
Uh, like to enter onto an eternal mystery is already well, it's the most like fecund source of creative energy in all of the arts and stuff like that. The most rich and abundant is kind of eternal truths, eternal issues. But yeah, no, that's very interesting. I completely agree. But again, you're getting into that. It's like an emotional language, and that's why this love really
Yeah.
interests me, because it is a movement of the heart first and foremost. It's like you have to be wonderstruck and say like, yeah. I think that has to be the drive, especially in the intellectual activity I'm doing. But it's I think it applies to all different areas. Like I just think there is just so much mystery. Like there's so much mystery
Yeah.
in the world, and it is quite the adventure to um, go along the path of like in seeing how weird and wonderful the world is,
Yeah.
um, in all sorts of different ways.
Well, yeah, when you mention that idea of like us losing the sacredness of conversation, like in some ways it resonates very true for me. Like I think we've lost the sacredness of what it is to be able to converse with other people. But I think in another sense, it's like we've lost the wonder of what people have to offer because we're so possessed by ideology. Um, and like, listen, ideology has its place, everybody has it, and everybody uses it to make sense of their world. But like, if it becomes that place that devalues the sacred, particularly the sacredness of people and what they offer in the reflection of the divine, I think we're in trouble.
Yeah, no, I can agree with that. Yeah, this is why the becoming like children things I think is important, because I think it's more a case of remembering something which is innate and which is very fundamental to who we are as human beings.
Mm-hmm.
It's what gives me optimism about things like that and like divisive discourse, because it's like I think everyone has to admit certain mysteries, and like if we're gonna think about them together, and there's great richness to that.
Mm.
Yeah, and so and I think it naturally sort of leads in the direction of the transcendental. Um, I don't know. That's been my experience anyway, as I said earlier, like about history and politics, and then going into like questions about values. I think I think it naturally leads to certain questions. Um, but then again, it's like you said as well. Like I think we all for sure have our temperament, and like some people, like I don't think politics is for me, but like for others, I think it would be. and I think it's important we have politicians. I think, and I personally like really respect someone who's going to lead a country, because like everyone's going to hate them.
Yeah.
Everyone, like it's quite I don't know. I find it quite worthy of respect. Firstly, myself. Not to
Yeah.
say that being uncritical, but my instinct isn't to just criticize. I mean, like it's like it's quite the thing to like say, okay, I'm gonna lead. Um, you know, it's not for everyone for sure. And
Yeah. Well, I think anytime you enter the political realm, you're opening yourself up to a lot of criticism. And
sure.
I've been thinking lately a lot about this idea of like creating around political ideas. Because the minute you step into the ring and say, I'm going to talk about something that's political or heated, you're going to get criticism from every side, including your own, because you're never going to be able to tell that story well enough. There's always going to be something you're missing. And that's, I mean, there's certainly conversations we can have about the way we represent, ideas in the world, and like trying to avoid, creating propaganda or what have you. But there is some sort of act of courage to step out and say, hey, I'm going to tackle this and find a way to shape it. I mean, I think, in this idea of everybody being religious, I think politics for many people has acted in the place of religion and becomes very much sort of doctrinal. So it can be that can be sort of a tricky place, because I think a conversation around politics when it has become your religion makes it much harder to engage well in those conversations.
Mm.
Um, but
Oh, I think
there's,
that's absolutely true. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, not that it's impossible or that,
Just underlines the primacy of religion to me, like proper religion, because I think we're all religious, but then it's like that religion can become disordered, and that's
mm,
what I kind of meant about transcending the discourse. Is like, yeah, moving beyond ideology can only happen in basically a mythic space
mm,
where you tell a higher story,
mm,
because um yeah, because for sure, I think I might have mentioned this last time we spoke, but I've often thought about this idea of like, I think Jesus said this like really interesting. What did he say? I think it's like resist not evil. He mentions it somewhere, and there's this thing of like entering into a highly polarized discourse can polarize you or something like that. It's like language is super powerful, and
yeah,
so like to accept the frame of, okay, like so with all sorts of discrimination and inequality, what I've always thought is that like instead of thinking in terms of men and women, different races, different disability, different things like this, just think in terms of the human, like just to
mm,
think in terms of, or just the spiritual, the dignity of the spirit, like to, you know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah,
because that discourse transcends the discriminatory discourse, like
mm,
the discourse of um polarization, duality, discrimination based on really like superficial aspects of our being is a flawed discourse and a degraded discourse, and is wrong, and I'm against. But like there's a very subtle thing of like, if I adopt that language, then am I not sort of continuing the spirit of that
mm,
division in some sense?
mm,
And again, I suppose that's the thing of unity and division I was talking about earlier. But it's like language that moves towards unity. I think again, the only way to do that is to talk in terms of um, like the soul traditionally is understood as what is essential to the human being, not what is uh like sort of circumstantial, what the accidents of our existence, that the different um yeah, like particularities, not to deny them, but it's like that I think what we most essentially are is our souls, and I think that talking on a soul to soul level is, yeah, transcends divisive discourse. I don't know. I've always thought that, and I think it's connected very much to the power of language, because if you perpetuate a certain language or mythos, then that's what its reality exists in. And that's sort of how I understand one of the things Jesus said about that is like not to resist it, but instead to just like talk higher, talk in the positive about what unifies, that is how the transcendence happens. That's how things change. Yeah. No.
I mean, it's interesting as a Orthodox Christian. I have a belief both in the spiritual aspect of ourselves, but also the deep connection with that to the physical. And so when I see this conversation, sort of as you've described, of going into the ice cream shop and trying to split the material, there's a part of that makes so much sense to me, because material does matter. And, in this next life, there is the hope that the physical comes back. And that's why a lot of our worship has to do with us standing and accepting the physical form of our bodies to remind ourselves of the thing we're hoping for. Yet there is that part of the spiritual and the dignity of human beings that does get lost in it, where then the conversation comes only about splitting the ice cream for all of these marginalized groups, and finding a way of like using that force to give us dignity. And it's much more complicated than that, isn't it? Yeah, it's a tough conversation to have, because there's a lot of bad things to talk about that, and that belief of wanting to give people chance and give people that place of dignity, when it has so often not been given.
For sure.
But also not losing yourself in it, where then it becomes about the physical and only the physical, and almost intensifies that outward participation as the thing that matters most. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, I mean, discrimination has happened, and I think like of course there's place for like genuine political grievance, and I think that's definitely characterized the 20th century.
Yeah.
Like no doubt, but I see the teaching of Jesus. I think things like what Martin Luther King said about the content of a person's character,
Yeah.
like, and not the color of their skin. Like, I think that's true, and I think like I've always thought that's true, and I think that is what, again, it's like what we were saying about like what is a character. Like a character, so this is a spiritual immaterial thing, like, but is still connected to what's most real, to virtue, to just the fundamental freedom of the human being, and the dignity of the deep dignity of the human spirit.
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't think any of those things have to do essentially with our social status, the color of our skin, the gender, those things. Those things, of course, influence our life and shape our lives. But I don't think that's how we are defined essentially, and I think that's a theological story to tell.
Yeah,
it is a theological story. It's not a political story, and I think that's what I mean is that transcends it. But it's also true. Like it just is true, and then like that is deeply, deeply radical and transformative to state that claim, which is part of why I think Jesus is one of the greatest storytellers ever, because that's the influence of those kind of ideas are incredibly, like, they're profound.
Yeah. There's a reason why 2,000 years later they're still so fundamentally important to a majority of the world's religions.
Mm-hmm. But it's seeing with the eye of unity. I think that's the thing. It's like seeing with the eye of unity, the eye of essential value, these things, and not seeing in terms of something like social status or something which is in classical terms would be like accidental, some different particular thing, seeing what is most essential and interacting with that. It's edifying. I think it helps remind us who we are. I think it's the affirmation of the sacred from which the secular in which the secular is grounded. Like, I think all of that is super important, and it's a question of imagination. It's a question of perception, imagination, intuition, seeing, seeing in a unified way, and seeing in a holistic way, seeing I really think it is a question of the imagination. Like, I think it's a failure of the imagination to see human beings in terms of how much money they have, for example, or whatever million different particularities or aspects of a human being you can say. Of course, those things characterize what a human being is, but it's like I think theologically it's not what's essential. Like, what's essential is most of the things we've discussed already, like our relationship to God is what's most essential, and our capacity to remember that and to speak that forth and to image that and to exemplify that. Right. Like,
well, and I think there's a reason why, when Jesus was asked, what does it mean to follow the law? What does it mean to, participate well with God? Well, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. I go back to this idea of love and this process of, I think sometimes love gets sort of oversimplified or kind of ooey gooey, where love is much more complicated than the warm fuzzy feelings that you have for your partner, or the process of doing kindness to others. Like, sometimes the kindness is speaking hard truths, or being willing to not give the material thing that they're asking for their own good. I mean, it particularly becomes complicated when you have issues of like a drug abuse or certain things where, what does it mean to love someone in that situation and fighting through that? It's not such an easy answer.
It's not easy at all, but I think it's definitely connected to affirming their spiritual nature at some level. And that's a hard thing to see in a modern context, or I guess, I don't know. It's UK is quite overtly secular in many ways, so it's not self-evident in some ways, but in some ways I think it's like super true. And I think it's true, and I think it's an act of the imagination to articulate this theological language is so important to these problems of political discourse you're talking about, to contemporary political issues, to the way society and families are ordered, to the way children are brought up, like all of these things. But that's the only language I can reach for is to affirm the Imago Dei, the image of God within the person, to recognize that. And only that can give me a basis for saying, like, no more ice cream, or stop, or with supporting someone with working for a drug habit, or these different ways in which we err, like that only again, if we're characterized purely by pleasure seeking instinct or something, there is no way of transcending that. But the thing is, we're free. I think we have to say that we are free, and we're free and rational in the sense of, in the ancient sense of, responsive to these deep values of goodness, truth, and beauty.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that has to be affirmed.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's like the truth, if we are free, and I do believe we are free, but that's certainly an argument for some people. It comes with a cost, meaning that, yeah, we're free to eat as much ice cream as we want, but that comes at a cost. And that cost might be slavery to the thing, to the created thing, and not the proper relationship with the good and beauty that is in the creation. So yeah, I love that point of the Imago Dei, of like trying to see God in, well, I mean, in everything, but particularly in people, as we are these images, these reflections of something bigger than ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Well, any sort of last thoughts or things we didn't cover that you want to get in before we close down the conversation?
I know. I thought that was wonderful. I thought, yeah, that covered some really interesting stuff there.
Yeah.
I feel like we yeah, went to a lot of different places that I wouldn't say there's anything I can think of.
Yeah,
It's
we covered a
just
lot. We went a lot of different places, and I'm definitely going to be thinking about it. I think love for almost anybody does seem to be a high order. And so that process of what does it mean to love and how do we properly order that value? That's, I think, the question we're going to be struggling with the rest of humanity, but certainly our lifetime. So it's given me a lot to think about. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for the discussion.
Thank you so much for watching. As always, I will close the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.